So, have you ever been on a train and there's quite a few people around you? Some people sat opposite you, some people stood around you, but for some reason, no one sits to the left of you or to the right of you. And you wonder why. How would that make you feel? Well, this is actually quite a common experience for foreigners who are living in Japan. It's been known as the Gaijin gap. Gaijin, which means foreigner in Japanese, which directly translates to outsider, and gap, obviously, referring to the space, the empty seat that is left beside you on that train. Now, this is a common experience, a common lived experience for many foreigners in Japan, and has even been talked about in publications such as the Japan Times. And even though Japan is becoming more and more diverse over recent years, often foreigners can feel excluded in society and a minority, which they are. I just want to caveat this by saying that this actually hasn't happened very often to me personally, but I have friends that have had this happen several times. And I also want to caveat that by saying that the experiences of foreigners living in Japan definitely differs between different ethnicities and colours, and the spectrum of colorism is something that is also affecting how foreigners may feel in Japan. For example, I have very white, blonde hair, blue-eyed foreign friends who can have very different experiences to my friends who are of colour and of darker skin. So there's a huge spectrum of different experiences, different foreign experiences in Japan. So what I would like to talk to you about today is my experiences living in Japan, being seen as a foreigner, even though I'm half Japanese. I am in Japan known as what is hafu, meaning half Japanese and half foreign. And my experiences here has really given me an insight into what it feels like to be an immigrant and what it feels like to be a minority in a society. And I'd like to share some of those experiences with you today and hopefully share with you some of the realizations that I've had about how we can improve diversity and, importantly, how we can improve inclusion in our communities. So, first of all, let me just briefly explain my background. My name is Jossie, and I was born in Tokyo, raised in Yorkshire. I felt very included growing up most of the time. I lived close to cities such as Bradford and Leeds, the headquarters of Stop Hate UK. And I never really knew what it felt like to feel like a minority. I was lucky enough to intern at Stop Hate UK back in 2016 at the time of Brexit, which was a very intense and extreme period of time for the immigrant experience. And it did give me a lot of insight into how hate crime and discrimination kind of affect people's lives and mental health and sense of safety. So I moved to Japan about a year and a half ago now, and it has been an incredible experience. And I would like to relate some of what I've experienced in Japan to how we can be more inclusive in our own communities, be that in the UK, the US, anywhere in the world. in any type of community. So some of the words that I will be using on what I've already mentioned, such as diversity and inclusion, microaggressions and unconscious bias. I'd just like to unpack some of those terms before I get started. So what is diversity and inclusion? So a fairly well-known, accomplished diversity and inclusion consultant whose name is Vera Myers is said to have quoted this phrase saying, "Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance." Now, diversity and inclusion is a lot more than just a dance. It's definitely not a party. But what I like about this quote is that it goes to show that there is a clear difference between diversity and inclusion. So diversity is having representation of many different identities in a community or a society, be that socioeconomic, be that ethnicity-wise, be that sexual orientation. And it's all well and good having those types of representations in society, but inclusion is where people feel involved and they feel appreciated and welcomed. So you can invite people to a party, but ask them to dance. Make them feel welcome. I'll also be talking about microaggressions, which is a term used to describe unconscious or unintentional or even intentional behavioral or environmental actions, interactions with people, usually from minority or marginalized groups, that can be negative or based in prejudice or stereotypes. For example, this could be asking somebody where they're from, implying that they are not from the same community as you, which is often or not an assumption. And I'll also be talking about unconscious bias, which usually leads to microaggressions, at least often unintentional microaggressions. So an unconscious bias is something that we all have. It's part of, our makeup in terms of categorizing society and trying to organize our worlds. But in order to make sure that these types of stereotypes or these types of categorizations are not damaging to other people, we need to be aware of them. So I would like to talk about how we can become more aware of our unconscious biases in society. So just to bring it back to the situation in Japan. Japan, I'm not sure whether you know, but it is one of the most highly homogeneous countries in the world. There is a population of around 126 million people and a population of just 2.9 million foreigners, meaning that the foreign population in Japan is just over 2%. Now, to put that in a little bit of context, the UK has a foreign population of around 14%, almost 7 times as much as Japan. Now, this can be brought back to several different reasons. Japan had a very strong period of isolationism for over 214 years in the 16th and 17th century. Japanese society was intentionally closed off in terms of trade, in terms of immigration. That's, you know, a historical assumption, but it has some implications in terms of its history and movement of people in Japan since that period of time. Japan's foreign policy or immigration policy per se has changed quite rapidly over recent years. In 2018, Abe-san, the Prime Minister of Japan, had made and is continuing to make concerted efforts to bring more foreign nationals, specifically from Southeast Asia, to work in sectors such as construction and agriculture. So last year in 2019 was actually the record year for the number of foreigners living in Japan, even though it's still very low. So things are changing. However, there are some uncomfortable issues around race and representation, particularly in the media in Japan. So, for example, NHK, which is a state-funded media company similar to the BBC, was recently strongly condemned for the representation of the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement. Even The Guardian reported on what they were doing in their representation of Black people and the narrative around BLM. And as part of my research and continued efforts to look into D&I whilst living in Japan, there has been growing outcry for Japanese media to be more aware of race and be more sensitive to race. As I mentioned, things are changing and there are more and more people who are passionate about equality and racial rights. For example, at the BLM march back in June of this year, there was over 3,000 attendees marching in Yoyogi Park, which goes to show that there are a significant number of people in Tokyo and Japan and all over Japan, including Osaka, who care about justice and who care about racial justice. Ironically, in all this, even though Japan is very homogenous, I have found myself in a work environment that is extremely diverse. I'm very proud to say that in the company that I'm working in at the moment, we have over 18 nationalities, and it has been a very exciting and well-represented place to be a part of. We actually have been meeting bi-weekly to speak about diversity and inclusion issues and create a platform for people to share their experiences and resources on how we can become better, not only as a company, but as individuals in recognizing our unconscious biases and being able to check our behavior at practices not only in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace too. So as part of this this meeting and this momentum that was built up in the company that I work at, I was propelled to speak with a diversity and inclusion facilitator. Her name is Nina Cataldo, and she is actually continuing to consult and facilitate conversations with NHK, the company that I previously mentioned, to improve awareness and to create safe spaces to learn and to speak about our unconscious biases and how we can improve our inclusion in our everyday lives. I wrote a blog post about that interview with Nina Cataldo, and I can link it in the description or share those resources with you if you're interested in taking a look at that content. So, what have I learned by being a minority in Japan? Well, first of all, I think I have learned the importance of community. Community, not just in a wide sense, but finding a sense of community for people who are like me. So growing up in Yorkshire, I knew no one that was half Japanese and half English. But coming to Tokyo, I met a lot of Hafu people like me, and it gave me a great sense of solidarity and solace in Japan, which can sometimes feel a little bit isolating. I felt a great sense of camaraderie with these people. And Nina, who I already mentioned, who is currently working with NHK, is also founder of the Hafu Women's Ladies Group, which is designed to create a sense of community within the Hafu women's demographic all over the world. It's a Facebook group, but it's also a social group where they do meetups and events. And what it has allowed me to access is people that are like me, who have had similar lived experiences to me, and generally make me feel very supported and welcomed. So that's one takeaway that I've had. Having community, having spaces, having events, and having dialogues with people that are similar goes a long way in making people feel included and supported when they're living in a minority experience. Second is the experiences of microaggressions. Now, I talked a little bit about microaggressions before. Microaggressions can be unintentional or intentional. Very often or not, they are unintentional, and they can come from a place of just pure ignorance in how questions or interactions can make other people feel. So, being Hafu, often or not, you're seen as being fully foreign, especially for me, because I feel like I'm very white passing. Physically, I'm very white passing. So what can be very common is people can compliment you on your Japanese. Now, for me, actually, that is still quite a compliment, because my Japanese is still in progress. I still have a lot to learn. But for those people, for my friends who are half Japanese and half another nationality or another ethnicity, and have lived in Japan all their lives, but don't look typically ethnically Japanese, when they're confronted with those questions or those supposed compliments on their native language, it can make them feel very uncomfortable. It can make them feel like an outsider. Now, part of the process of being aware of microaggressions is being able to think of it from the other person's perspective, or flipping it on its head. So, for example, if you were in a bar and you meet a friend of a friend and you've never met them before, but they say to you immediately, "Wow, you speak English so well." Imagine that you've spoken English since you could speak. So it's your native language. How would that make you feel? Probably a little bit taken aback. Probably feeling like they're being a bit patronizing. Maybe you might feel like you are different, or they're creating social distance between you and them. Another example of a microaggression that can happen for foreigners living in Japan could be when people comment on the way that you use chopsticks. So for me, this is quite entertaining. Sometimes people are very surprised that I can use chopsticks, or hashi, which means chopsticks in Japanese. And for me, I've been using chopsticks since probably the age of 2, maybe even a little bit earlier. I'm not sure when I exactly started to feed myself. So of course I can use chopsticks. So again, if you imagine that on its head and you flip it to the other side, imagine if you were in a restaurant and a friend says to you, "Wow, you're so good at using knives and forks." Again, how would that make you feel? So these are all examples of quite fairly small daily comments that might not seem like they are very troubling, they might not seem very serious or ill-intentioned at all, but if you think about how it can make people feel, especially over time, or even just in that moment, the consequences can be quite great. And what it does lead to is often minority groups or people that don't fit the typical mold feeling unincluded and perhaps feeling very othered in that experience. So often or not, these microaggressions are created and stemmed from unconscious bias. And as I mentioned before, unconscious bias usually comes from stereotypes, and stereotyping can often lead to prejudices. And it's difficult because stereotype and prejudice are all very heavily negative words, but it's often something that we all have. And that sense of awareness of our own unconscious bias towards other people is really key in being able to unpack it and make us more aware so that we can change our behavior, so that we can stop making assumptions about people and start making those people feel comfortable. So one recommendation I would really have if you are interested in learning more about unconscious bias in society, particularly related to race and framed mainly about race in America, is The Great Unlearning by Rachel Cargle. We've actually been using this as part of our discussions at my workplace, and it's a 30-day program where you can access video content, articles, and even do your own unconscious bias test so that you can really look at yourself and also learn from content by very, well-informed people. I would say that this content is free, which is all well and good, but if you do have the funds, it's really great to support those educators. So we're able to fairly compensate those people who are educating us on how to be better at being aware of our unconscious bias. So those are my 3 main takeaways in terms of what I have learned being in Japan, not only just from my direct experiences by being part of a community in Tokyo, but also the lived experiences that I have heard from this Hafu community, but also from my foreigner friends as well living in Japan. Interestingly, especially around unconscious bias, I'm very grateful for being in a very diverse and open-minded workplace that has given us the time and the space and the encouragement to actually take time to invest in our unlearning and unpacking of unconscious bias. So I just want to thank you so much for your time, for giving me this platform. I know that I'm speaking from only a quite personal experience of the Hafu experience, but I hope that greater awareness of phenomena such as microaggressions, unconscious bias, and importantly, diversity and inclusion can be somewhat helpful in making us all a little bit more aware and hopefully including those people that may not feel included at the moment. Thank you.